Donald Trump said that if Iran doesn't make a deal, there will be bombing, and it will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before. Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, said there will be catastrophic consequences if Trump is to carry this out. The USS Carl Vinson is on its way to the region. We know that F-35s and B-2 bombers are all being stationed there right now. But Iran has not capitulated to these threats. This is what Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had to say in response to them.
The enmity from the US and Israel has always been there. They threaten to attack us, which we don't think is very likely, but if they do commit any mischief, they will surely receive a strong reciprocal blow.
Things are intensifying on this front. Russia is now paying very close attention to this, especially in light of the fact that Russia has been slapped with new sanctions under Trump. What do you make of these developments, in particular this war threat against Iran, even as Donald Trump is trying to so-called handle domestic priorities?
The first thing I think everybody should keep in mind is that all of these conflicts the U.S. is pursuing are all interconnected. If you look at Iran, what is Iran? It is one of the core pillars of multipolarism. They're trying to strike at and collapse Iran in order to collapse multipolarism. So we hear about President Donald Trump supposedly wanting peace with Russia, which at this point I think everybody can see through as laughable, as a transparent ploy that I think Russia saw through for the very first moment it began. But if you collapse multipolarism by trying to take out Iran as a pillar, you're collapsing it on the head of Russia and also China. At the same time, the U.S. is pursuing an expanded confrontation and perhaps war with China. So how could you be doing that to Iran and China and many other places as well, while supposedly making peace with Russia? It just doesn't add up at all. Now, this is part of an agenda that stretches back decades. The US, and before the US, the British Empire, were obsessed with controlling Iran. This goes way back. The US and the British Empire at one point did control Iran, and then the Iranian people rose up. They ousted the client regime, and they've been trying to defend that hard-fought sovereignty ever since. And so there's a lot of overlapping but related factors taking place right now. So the thing that I'm worried about, because I just heard Iranian leadership say that it's unlikely the U.S. will strike. I think if you look at what has been going on in the Middle East and around the globe, the U.S. is becoming increasingly desperate and obviously more dangerous. I mean, demonstrably more dangerous. You can see it. You can see it in their policies. The whole U.S. war on Russia via Ukrainian proxies is extremely dangerous and is continuing uninterrupted since President Trump took office. This U.S. war on Yemen right now, taking place right now. They're bombing Yemen right now. They just rearmed Israel. You know, this ceasefire, this wasn't a ceasefire. This was a pause to rearm Israel, to restart hostilities against the Palestinians. And they're mass murdering Palestinians right now. They're doing it very deliberately. This is a very deliberate provocation to keep the entire region on edge and pushing it over the cliff of regional conflict. And so all of this demonstrates dangerous desperation. And I don't think anybody should underestimate both the will of America to try to fight its way out of this corner it's unnecessarily painted itself into, and the level of death and destruction the U.S. is still capable of.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Donald Trump on Truth Social now has said that these reports are greatly exaggerated about the threat of war, even though it was him that actually said it. Iran hasn't backed down from these threats. Iran has stood pretty tall, and they have rejected direct talks with the United States under pressure, and said that they will hold indirect talks about any issue because Iran wants to alleviate sanctions. But there's been a lot of commentary because all of this is about Iran nuclear threat. What's your take on this? Because this is supposedly the source of enmity toward Iran.
Yeah, well, it's all predicated on the supposed nuclear threat Iran poses. But as I've pointed out over many years, U.S. Corporate financier-funded think tanks, the actual interest driving U.S. foreign and domestic policy, they have for many years, they've said, if Iran were ever to acquire nuclear weapons, it would be only as a deterrent. Everything that they do is done in self-defense against what they admit is always a looming U.S. threat against the entire region. They admit this in their policy papers that are publicly published, just nobody reads them. The Rand Corporation and the Brookings Institution put out papers in 2009 going into this in depth, and they said that if, especially the Rand Corporation said that if Iran were ever to acquire nuclear weapons, they would be under the control of elite Iranian military units that already possess strategic weapons that Iran tightly controls. They do not proliferate these weapons across the region, and they don't use these offensively. They only use it as a deterrent. So if they were to acquire nuclear weapons, this is exactly what they would use them for, as a deterrent, as a defense against ever-looming U.S. aggression. Now, I hear people who are still trying to support the Trump administration make an oblique rationalization for what the Trump administration is doing, claiming that Iran's signed the non-proliferation treaty, and so this is a violation of it. And you have to understand the whole point of nuclear non-proliferation treaties is to not just eliminate nuclear weapons, but you have to eliminate the threat that drives a nation to acquire nuclear weapons. And all the United States has done is not only resist the disarmament and reducing its own nuclear threat to the world, but it has a decade-spanning policy of military aggression all around the world. If you look at China and North Korea, their nuclear weapon program wasn't out of a desire to have nuclear weapons to enhance their ability to project power worldwide. It was in direct response to the threat, the real threat the U.S. posed. You have to remember, the U.S. is the only nation on planet Earth in human history to use nuclear weapons twice against Japan. And if you actually look at the circumstances they were used under, irrationally and unwarranted, there was no reason to use them except the U.S. wanted to demonstrate power and give Japan its their perceived comeuppance for daring to challenge U.S. hegemony in Asia Pacific. But that wasn't the only issue. If you look at American history following World War II, there were many instances where and it's now admitted, and you can see this in U.S. government historical documents, where they were considering using them during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War. They even considered using nuclear weapons in Afghanistan. I don't know if people remember that, but there was actually a moment where they decided they might use. So they didn't just use nuclear weapons. They're only nation to use nuclear weapons. They not only have them pointed at other nuclear armed nations, they have even considered using them against non-nuclear armed nations. And that is in combination with America's decade-spanning use of military aggression through conventional means against all nations on Earth. All nations on Earth face this threat. So this is what Iran is reacting to say, they signed the treaty, so they have to stick to this treaty. It's like to make it real simple for people, it's like everyone signed a treaty to give up their handguns in a room full of people, and the U.S. is keeping their handgun. And not only that, they're going around the room shooting people randomly. And they said, if you try to pick up a gun and defend yourself, we'll shoot you sooner rather than later. But everyone is eventually going to get shot. So this is the logic that people labor under, trying to make that argument. I would say Iran would be irrational and radical for not wanting a nuclear deterrence at this point, considering what the United States has done over the decades and is still doing along and even still inside Iranian borders.
Yeah, when you're talking about the history of U.S. proliferation and threats of using nuclear weapons following their use of nuclear weapons, China, I think they were able to develop their first in 1964. I think they finished, but before that, they had been threatened with nuclear weapons multiple times by the United States in the Taiwan Straits crises. So, and the Korean War. So immediately, China put up a no first use policy, and it still holds to this day. So it's not as if nuclear weapons can't be regulated, can't act as an effective deterrent, which they have for DPRK, for Russia. If a war were to begin between the United States and Iran, what would be these catastrophic consequences that Russia is talking about? Because it appears to me that the warning here is that these consequences will be far-reaching and not simply affecting Iran.
I mean, obviously, just one more thing I want to touch on, because I saw someone bring it up in the comment section, and I'm glad they did this. There was already a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran, and it was under the Trump administration, where the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from it without any sort of real reason or evidence or basis. They just unilaterally withdrew. They said, this is not a good deal, and we're withdrawing from it. And I just want to point out that in the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia, they even said, they proposed making a deal with Iran, deliberately sabotaging it, blaming its collapse on Iran, and using that as a pretext to place additional economic and military pressure on Iran, which is literally and exactly what the Trump administration did. It was a two-part plan that began under the Obama administration, was handed off to the Trump administration. They both played their parts in cooperation with one another, not in opposition of each other. And now the Trump administration, who unilaterally walked away from the previous nuclear deal, is demanding that Iran sign another deal with this obviously unhinged, unreliable, untrustworthy party, the United States. And under what authority is the U.S. demanding all of this of Iran in the first place? Who designated them the party to pursue this with Iran? Nobody. So again, people have to, go to square one with this and see if this adds up even from the beginning, and it doesn't. Now, Danny, you're talking about what are the consequences of a war with Iran. I mean, you could already look at what U.S. war all across the Middle East has done to the world, and the destabilization that it causes in terms of populations shifting, people fleeing by the millions from these conflicts, the damage that it does economically. The Middle East is decades and decades behind where it should actually be if it was just left alone and allowed to develop along its natural, the natural course of things. And Iran is a hydrocarbon producer. They produce and export energy. China is a consumer of this energy. And so this isn't just some, I see a lot of people say, the U.S. is doing this because of Israel. The U.S. and before that, the British Empire were obsessed with Iran before there was an Israel. So this is about many things. It's about, we cannot tolerate an independent nation with an independent foreign policy in a region we want primacy over. This is also about confining, isolating, cutting off China from hydrocarbons, and confining it geopolitically within its borders before moving in on China itself. Iran is a close ally of Russia as well. So this is, again, like I said in the beginning, these are all interconnected conflicts. Attacking Iran is also part of undermining both Russia and China. So these are the consequences for Russia and China directly, but also for the global economy. Everybody's going to be affected. The Strait of Hormuz, all the energy that transits, that the ability of a spreading conflict across the region between the U.S. and Iran, affecting energy infrastructure outside of Iran, is a very real possibility. So it could spiral out of control. Everybody knows that Israel supposedly has nuclear weapons. They're an irrational actor in the region. They are. If Ukraine were to survive 30, 40, 50 years and enjoy lots of success and support from the U.S., that's what Ukraine would look like. And look at the damage Ukraine is already causing. This is what Israel's already doing, plus they have nuclear weapons. So tremendous danger. I don't think catastrophic, using the word catastrophic is hyperbole at all.
unlike perhaps the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 2001 war in Afghanistan, Iran has capabilities, the capabilities to defend itself to the extent that we get to this point of, well, Israel has 100 plus nuclear weapons. The United States is bombing Yemen, but bombing Iran probably it would be very difficult to undertake a so-called successful operation there of regime change, hence why Iran is still around today. So there is, I think, a lot of consequences to this that will explode, and not just in the faces of the multipolar world, because it would be extremely damaging for Russia, for China, for especially Iran, but it would be damaging to the United States, to Israel. It has far-reaching consequences, and I'm not so sure Donald Trump fully understands when he so glibly talks about bombing Iran.
I would just warn people against underestimating America's capacity, again, to cause death and destruction, to topple nations that we all thought were, not untouchable, but probably would have resisted collapse by the U.S. Remember Syria. I mean, Syria is the biggest warning for everybody. This was a country that we saw the U.S. Array all of its abilities and assets against in an attempt to topple the government there. Starting in 2011, alongside other nations, the U.S. already toppled. Libya is a good example. And not only did Syria prevail initially, Russia and Iran, they came to Syria's aid. They were in Syria. The Russian military was in Syria, or Iran was in Syria. And so in a lot of people's minds, and I'm not going to deny, in my mind also, I believe that Syria's position was relatively stable. And I underestimated America's ability to persist and eventually succeed in regime change there. They did. And the way they did it was by overextending Russia and Iran elsewhere, limiting their ability to deal with this knockout blow that they delivered finally in December of last year. And so if Russia and Iran are overstretched to the point where they could not keep the Syrian government in power, if they were unable to stop this knockout blow, it kind of makes you wonder where else they might be overextended, to what extent they're overextended, and what the U.S. might be able to do to complicate things further for Russia and Iran elsewhere, outside of their borders, but also within their borders. So we have to be very careful about that. Yes, Iran has capabilities. We have seen those capabilities against U.S. bases across the region, against Israel itself. We've seen the attempts by Israel to carry out strikes against Iran, and there's some questions about how successful they were. I think if they were,
I don't know if you've seen the videos, Brian, of Iran, the Iranian military, IRGC, at least the IRGC portion, but Iran has been posting videos on the regular since these threats have emerged, of their massive underground missile cities, testing their air defense systems, which we were told, Brian, that they were all gone. Israel had hit them. They were destroyed. All of Russia's gifted weapons were gone. It seems like that's not the case. So that's where I think this is where the complicated issue of what happens if there is an actual confrontation. It could get quite messy.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. And we see the U.S. is pulling out all the stops as B-2 stealth bombers. These are supposedly invisible to radar or less visible to radar. But we have seen weapon systems like this fail elsewhere. I mean, I think people remember the stealth fighter, the F-117 that was downed while bombing Serbia. And we have to remember that until the Syrian government collapsed and the military fled, the U.S. and Israel were reduced to using their stealth F-35 fighters, fifth generation warplanes, using them with standoff strikes, which means the planes never came in range of Syria's integrated air defense system. So if that's their problem with Syria, isn't that also going to be a problem with Iran? And as you pointed out, it's just the claim that Israel knocked out all of Iran's air defense systems in one or two strikes is absurd, just at face value. So yes, I think there's a little bit of underestimating on both sides of this conflict.
Syria, we didn't know that it was such a defeated nation at that time. Like the government was defeated. There's even many of these former ministers inside of the Bashar al-Assad government that have stayed in power and have taken the orders and jobs given to them by the HTS. So it's defeated. Now, Iran doesn't seem defeated. Iran seems they're pushing back hard. They're showing off their weapons. They're saying they're going to build nukes if they need them. They're going to have reciprocal blows. Perhaps you can talk about this contrast between the U.S.'s capabilities, which have been diminished by Ukraine, and Iran's capabilities, which they really haven't been tested. They tested them in Operation True Promise 1 and 2, but they haven't really been tested in battle. Like, they're lacking the ability. So your thoughts on this contrast here?
Well, and we've talked about this over the last year or so. Iran's biggest strategic deterrence right now is its long-range missile arsenal. This is something that they have spent years and years developing. We saw them use these missiles in the aftermath of the U.S. assassination, murder of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. This was during the first Trump presidency, by the way. It was an absolute, utter act of war. I always hear people say President Trump never started any new wars. He didn't end any wars, but he didn't start any new wars. It wasn't for a lack of trying. He did. He desperately tried to start a war with Iran during his first administration. We saw Iran use these missiles on U.S. bases. The U.S. was given a warning before Iran struck these bases. And so they had their air defense, their missile defenses should have been active and ready, and they failed to intercept these missiles. We watched Israel fail to intercept these missiles, and we have watched over the last 3 years the collective West bleed dry their air and missile defense capabilities as they funneled them into Ukraine, where they've been exhausted and also destroyed. So what exactly do they have left? And I saw news reports that the U.S. was moving air defense and missile defense systems from Asia Pacific to the Middle East, specifically to get ready for this operation. But you have to remember, they do not have the ability to rapidly replace these capabilities. So even if they work 100%, they exhaust their missile stockpiles, they're not going to be able to build them up faster than a nation like Iran, Russia, or China can build the missiles and other threats that they're supposed to defend against. We have watched this play out in Ukraine. So that is the biggest problem I think the collective West faces. You have to remember also that it's very difficult to overthrow a nation by just bombing, and we've watched the U.S. do this over many decades, attempting to bomb nations into submission. This is very difficult to do. But we have to remember the U.S. also has a lot of assets on the ground in Iran, along Iranian borders. The overthrow of Syria and now turning it into a breeding ground for extremism. This is exactly what they did in Libya. And then from Libya, they spread out across North Africa and also to the Middle East. They literally exported terrorists from Libya to Syria to continue fighting the war there. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I think people imagining that just one air campaign against Iran somehow is going to cripple or collapse the Iranian government. I mean, unless they use nuclear weapons, but wouldn't that be the ultimate irony that they're saying we have to stop Iran because they're going to use nuclear weapons, and then the U.S. ends up using nuclear weapons on Iran. But at this point, the U.S. is so desperate and so dangerous, you really cannot rule that out. And then what will the world's reaction be to that? I can't even fathom what the world would do in reaction to that. But we're at a very dangerous juncture where it becomes difficult to predict what will happen because the U.S. has become so irrational. And we could talk about this vis-a-vis China, this idea that the U.S. wants to maintain hegemony over the planet, despite being 4 or 5% of the global population, and the balance of power decisively shifting away from the collective West. I mean, that is irrational to begin with. So everything that follows from that becomes detached further and further from reality, becomes more and more dangerous.